I'm Jeannie Patterson. I'm Director of the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. And I am very pleased to be hosting Tatiana Dancy, who is an Associate Professor of Law at Melbourne Law School and also Director of the Juris Doctor at Melbourne Law School, we're very pleased to have her both teaching and performing that leadership role. We're here to celebrate the publication and launch of Tatiana's new book, which is Artificial Justice, which she will be talking about to us. And there'll be plenty of scope for questions and discussion. And if you go to the chat, you will see a link for where you can buy the book through Oxford University Press, or you can wait till tomorrow when it will be launched on Amazon as well. And then you'll probably get it faster. Sorry, OUP. And also we've got the a conversation piece that you can look at for a summary of the book. And questions should go in the Q&A. And James, you have a hand up. So I don't think you can talk to us directly, but you should be able to type into the chat or type into the Q&A. So do it. If you have got a question now, if you could do it that way, that would be great.
I'm happy to kick off with a question. So if there is one.
Well, I can see that James has his hand up, but I'm not seeing the question just yet.
That just popped in the Q&A. So, okay, well, I'll keep an eye out. Okay,
Yeah.
so I won't speak for super long anyway, probably about 10 minutes. So that'll leave lots of time for questions.
Fantastic.
Okay. On one afternoon in early 1870, Italian physician Lombroso had his eureka moment. Midway through a prisoner autopsy, he noticed a small dent at the base of his patient's skull. At the sight of that skull, he later wrote, "I seem to see, all of a sudden, lighted up, as a vast plain under a flaming sky, the problem of the nature of the criminal." He concluded that some people had physical traits harking back to the primitive savage: a misshapen skull, an asymmetrical face or forehead, a wide jaw, high cheekbones, long limbs, or big ears. According to Lombroso, people with these traits simply couldn't help but commit crime. So the safest thing to do was to lock them up before they got around to it. Shortly after, Charles Goring, so-called father of British criminology, took up the mantle of proving the relationship between heredity and crime. For Goring, the nature of the criminal type would be revealed by a road paved with statistical facts, a road that would, he thought, lead us to the correct conclusions with the same degree of reliability as the conclusions of an exact science, so pretty optimistic. And having studied British prisoners, he concluded that there were defective physical and mental characteristics that added up to a criminal diathesis, a diagnosable criminal condition defined by a set of characteristics that were so potent in some people as to, and I quote, "to determine for them eventually the fate of imprisonment." What should we do about this? Well, according to Goring, we should segregate the unfit and regulate the reproduction of those degrees of constitutional qualities: feeble-mindedness, inebriety, epilepsy, deficient social instinct, insanity, which conduce to the committing of crime. It's perhaps no surprise that in 1914, Leonard Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, used Goring's research to argue for a program of selective breeding, by which criminals would be segregated from the general population throughout the duration of their fertile years. Fast forward to 2024, and predictions about criminal behavior are being made with the help of algorithms. The Suspect Targeting Management Plan, the STMP, recently wound down by the New South Wales Police, used algorithmic risk scores to single out targets, some as young as 10, for intensive surveillance. In the UK, the Offender Assessment System, or ASIS, algorithms are used as part of pre-sentence information. So that shapes bail, parole, and sentencing decisions. And of course, in the US, the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. These have got really catchy titles. The COMPASS algorithms do something pretty similar, and that's probably the best known example. These examples have had lots of airtime, but few people realize that this still goes on in Victoria and New South Wales at the moment in corrective services. So I wrote about this particular example in the conversation piece that Jeannie has popped in the chat. And there's some more research in the works. And the Level of Service Inventory Revised, another catchy title, LSIR tool, is used by Victorian and New South Wales corrective services to single out prisoners that are predicted to be more likely to recidivate, that to reoffend. High-risk prisoners receive high-intensity interventions and they may be denied parole. Criminal justice is not the only area in which risk scores like this feed into significant decisions about how to treat people. The opioid risk tool, which some of you may have heard of, the ORT, is used by doctors in Australia and across the world to decide whether to prescribe pain relief for acute and chronic illness by predicting whether patients will misuse their medications. The Victorian government advises doctors that the opioid risk tool should be used to screen all patients for whom treatment with an opioid is being considered. And similar kinds of predictive algorithm are used across recruitment, sports, and education. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the factors that are used to make those sorts of predictions. There has been an explosion of interest in the topic of algorithmic justice. I'm hardly the first person to do this, but with rare exception, those conversations have focused on equality, so-called algorithmic bias and discrimination. It's an important goal, of course, and it merits the resources and attention behind it. But the point of the book, the point of artificial justice, is to argue that it does not capture all of the reasons that we have to be concerned about policies that use tools like the ones I've just mentioned. And so, of course, if we can meet certain thresholds of equality, I think there are still reasons to worry about the use of these tools. I think there are also reasons that relate to the value of having choices that allow us to chart the course of our lives. And that means, for instance, only being punished for things that we have done wrong, not for the characteristics with which or circumstances into which we were born. So predictive algorithms are rules for computers and sometimes for people to follow too, based on patterns in data. And they literally save lives, right? They are used to allocate organs, to triage patients, to make urgent medical treatment decisions, but they can also create and sustain unjustified differences between groups of people, and that's the equality part. So for instance, nearly half of the targets in the STMP program that I mentioned just now, that's the New South Wales policing program, were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples, and that compares with 3.2% of the national population, so a huge disparity there. So imagine that we want to develop an algorithm, call it Crime Buster, to help police patrol crime hotspots more effectively. So the police are trying to identify where crime is happening, and so they use this algorithm to do that. So we use data linking crime to areas populated by lower income families, and let's suppose that correlation exists. But since we cannot measure crime directly, that data is capturing rates of arrest. And here is the problem. The fact that arrest rates are high in those areas may reveal just as much about how perceptions of crime influence policing practices. And rolling out Crime Buster risks entrenching those prejudices in policy. And you could argue that something like that was going on in the STMP program. But the trouble deepens when we use statistics to make predictions about intentional action, so the things that we choose to do. That might include predictions about whether someone will be a good employee or student, whether they will commit crime or abuse drugs. There are reasons to be deeply concerned about how we make these predictions. And these reasons go beyond equality to the value that we place on the ability to shape our lives. Now, the factors that influence these predictions are often either concealed altogether or otherwise are very difficult to find. But a little digging reveals some surprises. So for the British OASIS system, that's the system that's used to sentence offenders, they include whether an individual has been either the perpetrator or the victim of domestic violence, and lots of other factors as well, but that one's particularly stark. The American Compass model captures parental divorce or separation and childhood abuse. In each case, these factors can make it more likely, not less, that someone will be sent to prison by a judge using the algorithm. For the opioid risk tool, it encompasses whether the patient's family has a history of substance abuse and whether the patient, if female, has a history of, and I quote, pre-adolescent sexual abuse, so abuse, child sex abuse, essentially. For the Australian Corrective Services LSIR tool, the risk scores are calculated from facts such as criminal friends, family involvement in crime, financial problems, living in a high crime neighborhood, and frequent changes of address, all factors that we may think are a little problematic when it comes to making decisions about how long we spend in prison, for instance. Now, I think there are good reasons for people to want the opportunity to make choices that reflect who we are, which meet our needs and goals. And there are good reasons to want the same choices as other people in certain areas, not to be singled out as incapable of choosing well. When we send someone to prison because of abusive or violent behavior that they have suffered at the hands of others, we deny these choices and we treat criminality as a fait accompli. Lombroso and Goring both thought that there was a certain type of person who deserved to go to prison simply because of the characteristics with which they were born, not because of what they had done, and certainly not because of what they'd done wrong. They would, I think, be quite at home in the age of algorithms. That's all I wanted to say about the book, and just to, suppose, underline that the particular contribution is, well, I spell out a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about inequality in the context of algorithms, but my particular focus is on this question of what else is going on that's not necessarily about equality. Are there other reasons that we might have to be concerned about the use of algorithms? And I focus in the book a lot on criminal justice, though not exclusively. Thanks, Deanie. So I'm super happy to answer questions, and I've left like the majority of the time to do that, so hopefully.
Okay, so lots of happy clapping hands coming up from the audience. So thank you very much for that, Tatiana, and thank you also for your just beautifully articulate and thoughtful reflection on this issue. I think everybody should read the book, actually, and I agree that this is a unique and really important contribution that you're making. I'm looking forward to reading the book too. I guess I'm going to just abuse the privilege of the chair, or take the moment to ask you a question, which is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer question, really. It's really explain a little bit more if you're thinking. So, you know, you've talked about the move from making predictions about criminality from people's features to predictions about criminality based on statistics, really, things that they have been subject to but not chosen. Is your complaint about, or is your investigation about using actuarial methods to make important decisions about people, or is there something different about the automated process?
Great question, thank you. That's great. So I should say it's not the use of statistics per se, right? So Charles Goring's research was a statistical method, but his conclusions were that there are just defective mental characteristics that mean people should be locked up, whatever they've done. So it's not statistics per se, and actually, what's interesting is that some of the time there are pre-sentence investigations and sentencing guidelines that allow judges to take into account factors like intellectual ability, for instance, which might raise some of these concerns that I've talked about. And so I should stress that it's not that algorithms are raising these problems for the first time. The particular risk is that because we use algorithms, because we use, say, a pre-sentencing investigation that just says, use the results of this algorithm, what we don't do is then interrogate which factors the algorithm is taking into account. So rather than having sentencing guidelines saying, you can take into account X, Y, and Z, and you might be, say that's not a closed list, and we have a set of common law rules that also allow judges to look at a range of other considerations. they are considerations that enter the public consciousness and enter the consciousness of lawyers more broadly. That doesn't happen, or doesn't happen quite so readily, when we use the results of algorithms like Compass, Oasis, or this LSIR program, because what we're doing there is just taking the output of the algorithm. So it's partly a transparency problem, but that then feeds into this broader exercise of really just not interrogating what we're doing when we either sentence or make decisions about how prisoners are treated and how long they spend behind bars. So it's a transparency and accountability question, but that really, really matters in this context, because I think we need to have serious conversations about what's the appropriate basis on which to sentence someone, for instance.
Thank you for that. That's a thorough response, and I think a really important point, because I think actually in the Compass case, we actually don't know what the weightings are on the factors that are considered. For example, we know what the questions are, but we don't know the weightings that are
yeah, and Compass isn't even the worst, because we at least know the questions. For instance, in the STMP program, we had none of that information was made public, and that was part of the inquiry. Part of its response was saying, well, the police don't have statutory powers to do this, but also, hi, it would be really good to know what's going on here. And I think mandating that when government agencies, government actors use tools like this, they publish the facts that feed into these decisions. I just don't think that's a huge ask.
No, thanks for that. So Catherine Smith asks a question, and Catherine, I'm sorry, I'd love to just switch on your mic, but I don't think I can do that the way this is set up. But so I will read out your question, but if I've got it wrong, you can just tell me. And the question is this: how would you approach teaching people to understand algorithms that guide practice to make ethical decisions, for pre-service teachers, for example?
What's a pre-service teacher?
I don't know. Catherine, you can tell us what a pre-service teacher is, but I guess the question is part of, you said we need transparency. I guess the question is, someone learning to teach.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, so is part of this also teaching people to understand how algorithms are used?
Yeah, and like I hope I do a little bit of that work in the book, which is to say it's not an exercise that's exclusive to computers, and it's not an exercise that becomes something new when we use, for instance, machine learning. It's really what we're doing when we look at large pools of data and we say, well, what are the trends in that data? And we take those trends and we use those trends then to make predictions about what will happen in the future. And if those predictions include what somebody will do, there's a kind of question mark for me about the way in which we use that information to make a decision about, for instance, whether they should spend time in prison. So I mean, that's a general question about how do we teach the significance of algorithms. And I think we unpack the different elements that have an impact on us in different ways. So we shouldn't really just say, oh, what are computers doing? That's new, because we might find that it's not that computers are doing something new per se. It's rather that the way in which they process data allows that data to be used in lots of different spheres where it hasn't previously been used. I don't think I have really a neat answer, but I'd like to reflect on that question about how to bring this sort of information to a kind of wider lay consciousness in a way that helps us to think about what's particularly significant. So I think that's really a take home for me as well. So thank you for that, Catherine.
Okay, so anybody else can put a question in, but I am going to ask another question now, and this is the question. So and again, it's almost a prompt, because I know this is in the book. And actually, there's another question, but I'm going to ask mine first. Sorry, Alessandra, which is this question, which is, if I think about sentencing or if I think about hiring, which are the two examples that you brought up, I won't talk about opioid addiction. Actually, maybe even that one too. if we leave it to a judge or an HR manager to make the decision, they will make the decision, and judges often talk about intuitive synthesis.
Yeah.
They just sort of, look at the factors and come up with a solution. Where if we use an actuarial process, a mathematical process, or if we use an algorithm that is more transparent, would it be possible that actually we're possibly prompting better decision making because at least we're thinking about the factors that should be used?
Yeah, great question again. So the short answer is yes, algorithms can do a way better job of making predictions, and actually in quite surprising areas. So that includes hiring, but it also includes things like whether or not we should allow a couple or a person to adopt. Often algorithms can be more predictive. So it's a question about what we mean by better decisions there. So there is an opportunity, I think, using algorithms to make better predictions, for instance. And there we need to just be very careful to develop our algorithms properly. So using sufficiently representative data sets that don't exclude areas of the population, and proxies that really do actually relate to the target variable. But of course, a better prediction doesn't mean a better decision necessarily. And there, my focus in particular is on making sure that we are only looking at facts that we should be. So I'm not averse to using predictions, say, in the context of criminal justice, full stop. It's just that I only think those predictions should take into account certain variables that relate to, for instance, past behavior.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. If I was, my response to that might be, yes, you're right. What's a better decision? But I might also say, well, I guess if I was anyway, no, actually, I won't ask that question. I was going to say, you're right. What's a better decision? And that is an interesting question, particularly in criminal justice, isn't it? Because that tension of, essentially, and somebody's about to ask this question, are we saying, well, on average, we think this group of people are more likely to reoffend, so we don't care. We're just going to keep the community safe. What I think your book is getting at is the respect we owe to every single individual to look at them as an individual, right?
Listen, I don't have a problem with making decisions on a population level. So it's not the use, again, it's not the use of statistics per se. I think we make sort of generalizations all the time, and actually using statistics helps us to do it in a more focused way. It's just that when we make these predictions, we should only make them on the basis of certain facts. And the way that we should look at which facts we're taking into account include, how good are these predictions? And that's literally like statistically, how does this algorithm perform? In terms of equality, do we focus the burden of error on certain groups or not? And that's quite important because this does happen a lot. But there may just also be other considerations. And for me, that includes if, for instance, we're making a prediction about whether someone will commit crime based on the behavior of their family and friends or how they have suffered growing up. There are other costs for us, and that includes the value, the instrumental value that we have in making our own choices. So, the value to me of staying out of prison and being able to conduct my life on the right side of the law. But it also includes, and I won't, like, you can capture this however you want to, but it includes non-instrumental values as well. For instance, the symbolic value of according everybody choices, and the same sorts of choices about how to pursue certain values or goals in our lives. So for instance, if we decide that we're going to give the vote to everyone except women, then we might communicate something about the status of women in society and their capacity to make choices. If we say that some people are able to make the choice to stay out of prison, but other people aren't, what are we communicating about those groups of people? And that's a non-instrumental cost, or a cost that's not just instrumental. It's particularly worrying, I think, in the context of criminal justice, because we don't actually have objective variables. There is no such thing as a way of measuring the crime, right? We look at these proxies like arrest and some sort of involvement in the criminal justice system. And those are incredibly laden variables because they depend on policing practices. So it's a very nebulous area and one that really matters for individuals.
Thanks. Okay. Hosts hundreds of questions. Alessandra, I'll read them out because I think the audience can't necessarily see them, but I'll forgive me if I read them out. Alessandra asks two, I think, related questions, which are, what was the most challenging aspect of researching your book? What was particularly interesting to you? And were there misconceptions on the topic of algorithmic justice you had prior to writing the book that you learned about? So it's about that writing process. Fantastic.
Yeah, they're great questions. For me, I was delving into areas of moral philosophy that I just wasn't equipped to delve into. And what's interesting there for me, or I suppose for researchers generally, is that so I'm looking at questions of justice, but it's really easy to say, okay, well, who's written about justice? Let's take that framework. And so you can look at rules, and that's a political theory of justice, or you can look at there's some, John Gardner's written some great stuff about justice in the context of law. And the temptation there is to take that framework and say, like, how do I apply that framework to this area? The problem is that it becomes quite, like, it can be quite, it can hamper you a little bit, because then you have to force everything into that way of thinking. And it wasn't until, and I found reading, I would encourage you to read Tim Scanlon's book on inequality, and I'll pop that one in the chat as well, because he does a really good job there of saying, well, let's not ask these questions by saying, first of all, what's our definition of justice and what falls in and what falls outside of that definition. He says, what are the reasons to worry about the types of policies that we might be using in a particular area? Let's look at those reasons. Let's forget this dressing of justice and just say, who cares and why do they care and what interests are at stake? And so it wasn't until I started thinking like that, saying, what's at stake for individuals and how do we ask those questions and answer those questions, that I was able to research effectively. And so I think I wrote this book 5 times over, and it was very frustrating. And I had an ex-colleague of mine at LSE read something related, and he panned it, absolutely panned it. And that was quite humbling for me. And I really had to start from square one and say, okay, well, let's get rid of this dressing and really think about these questions head on. And it's exhausting. Yeah. And then the other thing, misconceptions, I thought machine learning was this like super scary new thing that did things that creates problems of its own. And it does to an extent, right? There are problems of transparency and there are also problems of outsourcing, but they're not new problems. And it's easy for us to say, well, it's machine learning and that's what's causing the problem. And a lot of the time, really, it's not. It's a question of, should we be outsourcing this type of work to private companies in the first place? Or secondly, what are the questions we need to ask in order to get the information we need? And actually, a lot of the time, it doesn't matter that we're dealing with proprietary algorithms. We still can get to the bottom of that. So I think it was machine learning that threw me for a loop initially. And then, I started untangling algorithms to the extent that it was possible to identify exactly what was causing the problems that I wanted to address.
Thank you. All right, so James asks, we are now seeing the reality of the Tom Cruise film, The Minority Report, which related to this issue, the issue of predictive policing. Algorithms are only as good as the quality of the composition and what factors are initially incorporated in the algorithm, including its bias and inclusion of potentially relevant factors. Is there an inherent risk of predictive profiling being used to suppress social or ethnic groups whose views or interests are opposed to the government or enforcement entities utilising the predictive profiling?
Listen, I think there are lots of different elements to that. Let's start with Minority Report, because that's the fun bit. I don't know how many people have seen Minority Report, but the premise is that you've got these precogs who can see the future, and the Department of Pre-Crime or something is employing them to arrest people before they commit crime. So the difference here is we don't actually know the future, right? We don't have that information. So instead we're guessing. And when we do that, we don't give people the benefits of the doubt. And so that's what's worrying for me, and maybe even more worrying, that it than it kind of was in the film, where we actually know the future. The question about predictive profiling being used to suppress social or ethnic groups, I mean, clearly, right? So clearly that's happening to some degree. And we saw that with the STMP program, which was one of the reasons why it was wound down. Now, what's interesting to me is as much the way in which bias can then feed into these programs, and we're entrenching then these preconceptions into policy, it's also the choices we make about where we use algorithms. So I had a question on ABC Radio Sydney earlier about, well, why don't we use algorithms for white collar crime? Like, it's an interesting question. So it's an interesting way in which we divide up resources. And it's almost as if, and we saw this with RoboDebt, that we're willing to take the risk on certain sectors of society, but not so much with others. And I think those decisions about resource allocation in the first place, and this happened also in the UK with decisions about the allocation of benefits, is like, why do we keep seeing mistakes in algorithms happening where those algorithms are being used in a way that particularly impacts minority or otherwise underprivileged groups?
Thank you. And Hixie says, by can putting humans in the loop correct the injustices caused by algorithmic decisions? What do you think about this? Can you give an illustration of different kinds of circumstances of humans in the loop? Which I would also note that our good colleague Jake Goldenpine's doing work on this very question as well.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, because it's something that is a bit of a bugbear of mine, and I do talk about it a bit in the book. There was this case, Loomis, State and Loomis, which considered, or particularly the state of Wisconsin and Loomis, which considered this question of not just, is it okay to use algorithms in sentencing? And that was a particular defendant who said, well, Compass was used to make the sentencing decision. I was rated as high risk, and that's not fair for all these different reasons. Now, one of the reasons was, he said, well, you shouldn't be using automated decisions to make automated programs to make decisions about individuals, full stop. And the judge looked at that and said, no, because it doesn't matter. We've got a judge who's considering this information. Well, first of all, often kind of corrective services, and then a judge considering the output of the algorithm. So they're not just, swallowing what the algorithm says and repeating the answer. They're taking that as part of the decision. And the judge there in the Loomis case says, well, judges can rectify the problems that come out of, say, using algorithms in a biased way. And that to me is wholly inadequate. It doesn't work, right? How would we decide just how much weight to give an algorithmic output? And why would we do that? Either the algorithm is good at making predictions and we think it's justified using the algorithm to make these sorts of decisions, or it's not. And if it is good, we shouldn't have humans jumping in and altering the outputs, because do you know what we're going to do? Is we're going to disagree with the outputs of algorithms in a context where it conflicts with our preconceptions about what we think the right answer should be. So in other words, we'll use those outputs or discard those outputs in a way that allows us to give practical weight to our human prejudices. If the algorithm is not good at making predictions, if it makes predictions in a way that concentrates the burden of error on certain groups, if there are other reasons why we shouldn't be using algorithms, because, for instance, we think it denies people the choices that they should have, but it's not going to be enough to have a human jump in after the fact and disregard the algorithmic output to some extent. That ad hoc way of decision making is such a cop-out. And I really disagree with the decision in Loomis for that reason and others.
Thank you. All right. Now we've got a question from Josh, who says, it's more love hearts. Well, that's good. I think people are enjoying this conversation. So that's sure. It's a good conversation and quite unique. So Josh says, correct me if I've gotten this wrong, but it seems you're encouraging the reader to fundamentally appreciate the importance of with the agency of offenders, both in order to achieve a more egalitarian sentences and as a means of reducing recidivism. Do you think justice systems, in the light of more recent moves towards addressing the causes of crime, are doing a better job of respecting the agency of offenders?
Okay, so there are some different elements there. I'd say that for me, there are different reasons, right? I think we have reasons relating to the value of choice, and I use the term choice rather than agency, because to me, it's not that there is a certain value to autonomy, and that it's autonomy, the exercise of autonomy, that attracts consequences. I think there's a danger to saying we punish people when they make bad choices for that reason. That autonomy is a kind of complex, and it's not necessarily the case that we can justify punishing people because they have made bad choices. So I'll just leave that language of agency and autonomy to one side. So I think there are reasons relating to the value of having choices. Those reasons are instrumental and non-instrumental. There are reasons of equality, and there are other reasons about predictive accuracy. All of these reasons go into whether or not a particular policy of algorithmic decision-making is justified. So that's the first part. Do I think justice systems looking at the causes of crime are doing a better job of respecting or giving appropriate recognition to this value of having a choice? I absolutely think that the answer is not locking people up because they are poor. And I will say it like that, because that is literally what happens in the context of tools like Compass, Oasis, and the LSIR tool. They look at poverty directly and indirectly. Poverty causes people to spend more time in prison. And I can't say that clearly enough, because I think it's wholly unjustified. So we should look at the root causes of poverty and support people who are in those situations. Now, of course, that's idealized. And it's so easy for me to say, we shouldn't use algorithms, we should support people who are poor. Great, like, wonderful, I've done my job, I can walk away. That's not something that we can use in practice. So instead, I think there is an easy answer to this particular problem, or at least a first step. And the first step would be to say, well, if we're going to look at poverty at all, we should look at it as a mitigating factor rather than an aggravating factor. And I don't think I'm reinventing the wheel. I don't think poverty should be used to send people to prison. I think it should be used as a way of saying, okay, this person was given bad conditions that made it harder for them to make meaningful choices on the right side of the law. Let's not send them to prison. Let's come up with another answer to the fact that they have done something wrong, if they have. And I think that's not super wild.
Okay, Josh, I'm just anybody that has asked a question and would like to make a response, you may do so if you wish. I guess otherwise I'm going to ask, following up on that. I mean, I guess if we're looking at, so one of the suggestions that's been made with this sort of human in the loop idea, for want of a better word, though I don't think that's a good description, is in fact that, sorry, James has asked the question, but is in fact, if you take some of the work by people who've written on, say, the ethics of care, they'd say use this information about police, jails are full of people who are poor, or in some other way disadvantaged. Jails are full of people who come from, in Australia, Indigenous people, First Nations people. Can we use this technology to lay that clear and then make choices that actually learn from those statistics and intervene early to try and change those trends?
Try again, because there was lots in there and I'm not 100% sure which bit I should answer.
Okay, I'm not even going to answer that question because I can see more questions on the screen. So James asks, as AI becomes increasingly utilised, the old question of who polices the police's material, who should be allocated the task of compiling relevant algorithm, and what constraints and oversight should be imposed on those algorithmic compliers? That's a beautiful question.
Yeah. So there's a kind of 2 points at which we can do this, right? So we can either say, well, let's code from the bottom up, and let's do this in a way that's transparent, or we can have these algorithms put together in a way that allows us to see what's going on, and then we have a body that decides whether it's appropriate to use an algorithm of this nature in the context of criminal justice, for instance. And I've seen this other question, so I'll come on to that. It's not just about criminal justice. What that looks like is a public organization or public body of sufficiently expert individuals, both who understand the way in which algorithms work, but also who understand the nature of criminal justice. There should actually, I think, be governmental oversight of the process of deciding whether or not to use a system of algorithmic decision-making in the context of, say, policing, or indeed if there's going to be a government edict to the effect that in healthcare we should use a particular algorithm, then that decision-making process should be done in a robust and transparent manner. It's not, again, I don't think it's not a huge ask, right, to say, for instance, if we're, and again, this was why the public investigation that took place in the context of Stomp, why they ended up saying it's deeply inappropriate for the police to be doing this, is there was no statutory footing for the powers that they were using. And I think requiring, at the very least, governmental oversight of a decision to use an algorithm like that in policing at some level, and they were really saying it needed statutory oversight, or a statutory foundation. Either way, it requires us to have any decision like that take place in a public forum. The question, I'll see this, there's a question about the AI and justice course, which I'm teaching on the Melbourne Law Masters. The question is it about criminal justice and AI? And it's not just about criminal justice. It talks about recruitment, it talks about sports, it talks about healthcare, it talks about criminal justice, lots and lots of different areas. A follow-up question, can AI be used in legislation drafting? Do we have any drafters here? At the moment, I mean, you could start that way, right? You would want to make sure you can use AI if you want to come up with a text, but you're going to end up needing to refine that very closely to make sure it achieves the goals that you're aiming at. So like the short answer is no, not right now, but tools like ChatGPT have an incredible range of uses. And if they're a starting point for lots of exercises, then that's not a concern per se, as long as those exercises still take place in a sufficiently robust way. That's not me endorsing using ChatGPT to write drafts of essays before you submit your assignment, just to be clear.
Okay, so another question, which is from Sue, and that says, in relation to the distinction between algorithms making good predictions and algorithms making good distinct decisions, how do you think the gap between the two can be narrowed?
It shouldn't be narrowed. Sue, that's a great question. We're not narrowing that gap, right? The algorithms are making the predictions. We have to decide how they're making those predictions, so which factors are taken into account. And once we've got those predictions, those are then fed into a process of decision-making that says, okay, well, we know that we've got this risk score for a particular offender, say, so we think that they're X amount likely to offend again. That information is only part of the picture when it comes to deciding how that person will be treated by the criminal justice system. We have a prediction, we have a decision, and the twain never shall meet.
I think you're pretty clear there. All right, I think we've got time for a couple more questions if people would like to nominate their questions. Or, Tatiana, what question have we not asked you that you would like to speak about? What have we missed?
I don't think anything. There's nothing burning that I wanted to talk about that I haven't had a chance to talk about. I think there are still interesting questions about the information that we require of people who are, or the algorithms themselves. What does transparency look like in the context of algorithmic decision making, as well as that question of is having a human in the loop adequate. And for me, I think it matters what the type of decision that we're making is. So I think sometimes it might be enough to have statistical information, and sometimes we need to know which facts are feeding into those decisions. And I think the distinction turns on whether these are decisions that relate to intentional action. So I talk about that, what transparency looks like in the context of, or in the final chapter. And I think it's interesting in that context that lots of the explainable AI literature has focused on beliefs, which relates to the literature on epistemic reasons. Forget that word. It just means reasons that relate to what we know, essentially. And for me, my interest, and I think the interest when we're making decisions about sentencing, for instance, or decisions about how to treat people anytime, what we're looking at is what's called practical reasons. We're looking at reasons that are to do with the decisions that we make about how to act, and that includes decisions about how to treat people. If we're looking at practical reasons, we need to look not just at what we know and believe and think, we also need to look at what we're justified in doing. Or in other words, we need to look at normative reasons. And normative reasons are all about justice. They're all about what we can justify doing. It's not necessarily the case that we are justified, but it's the things that we think we're justified in doing when we make decisions. So, for instance, I'm going to take an umbrella outside because it's raining and I want to keep myself dry. That's my goal there. Like in that context, I'm justified in using the umbrella because it is likely to rain, right? So that's what I mean by justified, not justice more broadly. So these decisions about what we do require us to think about those questions of normative reasons. And I think that's a bit of a missing part in the literature at the moment. And if we do that, if we look a little bit more closely at those sorts of things, we might find that actually we can get away with less in the context of algorithms. We can get away a lot of the time with statistics. It's enough to show that the algorithm does work, that it does predict accurately, and that it doesn't concentrate the burden unevenly. And that's why I think we can justify using algorithms a lot in the context of medical decision-making, where they do save lives all the time. Really did in the context of COVID. But it might be different in the context of, say, sentencing, where we're making a decision about whether or not we think somebody will reoffend and therefore how long they spend in prison. There, I think we do want to know what facts feed into these decisions. So I think we don't need to have a single answer to that question of what transparency looks like. So I talk a little bit about that, but I see we've got some more questions.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, so we've got lots of questions now, of course. So I'm actually going to start with this one, which is down the bottom, which is, can you just clarify the differences of instrumentality and non-instrumentality you mentioned?
Thank you for that question. It's really important for me to take a step. I was getting mad about acronyms earlier today, that I just I don't like when people use terms or acronyms that aren't widely understood in a context where you're sort of expected to know but might not. So thank you for that question. So if we're talking about instrumental reasons, what we're talking about is reasons that have this sort of end impact. They have a consequence, and that consequence is what we're particularly worried about. So when we talk about instrumental values in the context of people, what we mean is whether or not that the thing that we're talking about has an impact on our lives, how it shapes our lives, the consequences that it has for us. So an instrumental reason is one that we think about in the context of consequences. When we're talking about non-instrumental values or non-instrumental reasons, we're talking about reasons that might have bite, might have significance, whatever their consequences. It might be wrong or right to do something, even if it doesn't have the effect of making someone's life go better or worse. So if an instrumental reason in this context would be a reason that relates to whether it makes our life go better or worse, a non-instrumental reason might matter whether or not it has that effect. So instrumentality is about its impact. Non-instrumentality can be a reason that whatever effect it has still matters.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the question about the top books to read, because I think we can put those in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll put Scanlon's book there as well.
Yeah, so we have a question about, I don't know if you want to talk about smart contracts and virtual cryptocurrencies and AI, or you'd like to talk about the, I'm going to give you the choice because choice is important. We've learned that. Would you like to speak about the future of AI and smart contracts and cryptocurrencies, or perhaps and the future of AI and decision making?
What's the future of AI and decision? Where's this? Is it the top question?
No, Sue Jang's question. How do you see
Oh,
the
yeah, Sue. Hi,
algorithms
Sue.
decision making?
Sue's one of my students. Hi. How do you see the future of algorithms in decision making? How should it grow and develop in the coming decades with oversight and transparency? Yes, that's a simple, yeah, with clear decisions about where we think algorithms are appropriate, which algorithms are appropriate and why, and then a clear sense of which factors are taken into account when we make decisions.
Thank you. Can AI then be used to reduce corruption?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And it's, or like AI is such a huge, such a huge term, right? It can capture a whole bunch of different things. And often it's like AI is used when we're doing something that we couldn't do 10 years ago. And so it can be used even when it's something that's not really anything fancy or anything fancy with computers. It's absolutely the case that the use of big data can give us trends that allow us to determine how to distribute resources more effectively in a way that can target corruption completely, absolutely. But again, only if we are doing this stuff transparently, and that's so important. And whether it's used to target corruption versus something else is going to turn on decisions that are made at a public level, and they require our public decision makers to target resources in that way. And that's not what's happening at the moment. I would like if it was the focus of resource allocation, but perhaps it will be if there are enough of us who are sort of kicking and screaming about the appropriate use of algorithms. And you know, that's why CAIDE's so important, right? That's the work that CAIDE does, is to really shine a light on how we're using algorithms and how we're using AI more broadly, what impact that has on individuals, and connecting kind of the work that academics are doing to policy more broadly. I think that's why it's so important to have institutions like CAIDE that really bridge those gaps, so that all of us who would really like to see this stuff change for good can have that impact. So we're all super grateful to Jeannie and to Tim.
Well, thanks for that. That was very kind of you. We're very grateful to you and all your work at Melbourne Law School and basically running the tech program. So works both ways. What do we think? Look, it always is going to come up. Smart contracts, cryptocurrency, and AI. Do they have a relationship? Can AI?
I shouldn't pull that face when someone brings up crypto. I don't think it's helpful to, for instance, take a totally open network that has no governance structure or oversight, where the value structures are completely opaque and individuals can be quite straightforwardly taken for a ride. I think it's helpful to use tools like that to make important decisions. And I definitely don't think that people should be encouraged to invest in ways that they cannot afford to. I think the term crypto has been used in lots of areas where actually it's not reinventing the wheel, and I have no problem with that if what it effectively does is enable us to do things better. And that sometimes does happen, right? It happens in the context of creative endeavors, where it shines a light on the mismarriage of people's creative work and the rewards that they get. So it can be a catalyst for responsible innovation. It can also be a catalyst for fraud. And I think it's quite important to be clear about what we mean when we use those terms, say crypto or blockchain. Are we really talking about unpermissioned systems, totally open systems? Are we talking about permission systems where we do have those sorts of governance structures? And why? I think it's a really good example of trying to sort of throw a computer at a problem and wondering why at the end of the day we have some degree of that chaos in the sense of individuals taking advantage of one another, because we do need governance structures and we do need transparency and we do need rules. And people found this when, for instance, lots of money goes missing in the DAO hack. Suddenly they were saying, well, is code law, or is there a way of unwinding this theft that we think has taken place? We do fall back on questions of governance and law, and I think they're important. And I think there are lots of ways in which AI can be used as a force for good, and that's particularly true in the context of healthcare. And I don't think crypto is one of those avenues.
Okay, I think we know your views on that one now. If people stay on, we'd love you to put your top picks in the chat. But I guess the last question is probably a good question, because I'm reading this is a little bit existential. James says, if you were personally subject to an algorithm, what would be your reaction? Well, you'd hand someone your book, but apart from that.
Yeah, so it matters a lot, doesn't it? What context we're talking about. So let's suppose that, and I should apologize because I should have given lots of trigger warnings throughout this, and I haven't. But let's suppose that my liver starts failing and I go into hospital, and the question is, how am I prioritized for a liver transplant? If the doctor comes along and says, well, you're relatively young, I probably can't even say that anymore. I'm 36, I don't get to claim youth anymore. But let's say I'm claiming youth. You're relatively young. We think you've got a good chance of surviving without a transplant in the short term. So we won't give you one. We're going to wait 6 months. We think you'll be absolutely fine. You will have some ill effects, but we have other patients to worry about. If they explain that to me and they used an algorithm to prioritize somebody else on that basis for a transplant, I would have no problem at all. If, on the other hand, I go before a judge and a judge says, oh, you didn't grow up in a very affluent area. I see here that your family have been involved in crime. Oh dear, it looks to me as if you've moved address quite a lot. That doesn't seem like a very good thing. Let's send you to prison for longer than you would otherwise have gone. I might have some reason to be concerned. And that's happening every day to people. And they haven't got the tools to communicate why that's a problem. And I think lawyers haven't been making those cases well. I think if you look at the Loomis litigation, you can see the problem that the lawyers in the case had of articulating why Compass is a problem. And I think part of what I'm trying to do is to help provide tools to communicate the problems with using algorithms like this to make really significant decisions about how to treat people.
Well, thank you. And I hope that everybody has the opportunity to read the book, because I think we've had a little taster today, but there's a lot more to read and explore and understand there. And I would also remind people that Tatiana Dancy does teach a lot of this work at Melbourne Law School, which is not to say I'm saying we all have to come here, but there's many opportunities to engage with her work, and lots of work still to come, I'm guessing. So Tatiana, I'm going to ask you to put any recommendations in the chat, but given more time, I'm going to ask everybody to show their appreciation in whatever way is appropriate in an online faceless forum, which is probably to send claps and love hearts up into the ether, which is pretty lovely. Yes, I'm sure we'll enjoy our next seminar opportunity.
I'm really grateful to you, Jeannie. I'm so grateful for all the questions. And just to say, if anyone wants to follow up, you have my email address. There's the conversation piece, which is like a nice starting point. Don't feel like you have to go away and buy or read the book. But if you are interested in this stuff, I'm always happy to chat. And I hope you are interested. There are lots of reasons to be interested, I think, and to have a think about whether these things and why these things matter.
Yeah, this is certainly the pointy end of technology law, I think. So, or law and technology, or whatever you want to use. All righty, thank you, everybody. Tatiana, put some books in for us.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything new. It's going to be stuff that, algorithms of oppression.
Kathy O'Neill and
algorithms of oppression. Yeah, Jeannie, do you do this normally? Are you going to put stuff in as well?
I wasn't going to, but I guess we could.
I'm just gonna, there are a couple just things that I found useful along the way. Algorithm present, the master algorithm. So things that I found educational as well as things that, you know, make a particular case. I definitely just had to try to spell oppression twice and failed. Is that right? They're two separate recommendations there.
Beautiful. No, that's good. The question is, how can we get the book? If you go to the chat, there's a Oxford University Press URL, but it'll be available on Amazon tomorrow. So
yeah,
that's great. And algorithms of math destruction would be the other one.
Algorithms of, is it it's math destruction.
Math destruction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Read Tatiana's book and you'll find all the references in there. All right,
yeah,
everybody.
And great stuff also written, some of my recommendations, but great stuff, not just written by white men, but also written by Black women, by women, by a whole range of authors in this area. And it's really great to me that there's been a platform for a whole diverse range of voices in this area.
Fantastic. All righty. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next seminar.
Thanks so much.